Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our feature shir for tonight. So last week in our shir, we spoke about the blowing of the shofar, or I should say the not sounding of the shofar when Rosh Hashana falls on Shabbos, as it does this year. The last time this happened was 11 years ago, and of course the halacha, as we observe it, as brought by the Shulchan Aruch, is that when Rosh Hashana falls on Shabbos, Ein toikin b'shofar, we do not blow the shofar. And in our previous shir, we really looked at the halachic sources. So we analyzed the Mishnah, the teachings of the Gemara, and the way it was interpreted and applied in the works of the Rishonim. But tonight we're actually going to take at least in my mind, a fascinating historical journey back into 19th century Jerusalem, to the old Yeshuv, where this topic of not sounding the shofar, or sounding the shofar on Rosh Hashana that falls on Shabbos, really became the source, the hotspot of an international controversy and a huge halachic debate that really went across the entire Europe, between Jerusalem and Hungary, and back and forth. So just quickly, a little background for those who were not with us in our previous year. It will help in our understanding of tonight's discussion. So it all really starts from a Mishnah. The Mishnah is in the 4th chapter of Masechta Rosh Hashana in the Mishnah on Daf Chavtes Amud Beis in the Gemara. And the Mishnah says that Yom Tov Shel Rosh Hashana Shechal Liyos B'Shabbos B'Mikdash Hayutoikin Avaloi B'Medina. That when Rosh Hashana falls on Shabbos, says the Mishnah, they would blow the shofar in the Beis HaMikdash, but they would not blow outside of the Beis HaMikdash. And according to Rashi, that means not in Jerusalem and not anywhere else. And we explained that the reason for this is by rabbinic decree, meaning that on the biblical level, we sound the shofar on Shabbos. Midoraisa, the shofar could be blown on Rosh Hashana of Shabbos, but the Chachamim, the rabbis, made a decree because they were concerned that because everybody is obligated in the mitzvah of shofar, not everyone is proficient in how to sound the shofar, and the sages were worried that an ignorant individual may carry the shofar in the Rosh Hashanah, in the public domain on Shabbos, thereby violating Shabbos, in order to take the shofar to the expert to go and learn how to blow. And therefore the rabbis saw fit to institute a gezerah and to say that in such a kliyus, when Rosh Hashanah is on Shabbos, we do not blow the shofar. The Beis HaMikdash was an exception because, as we mentioned last time, the rabbinic decrees of Shabbos do not apply in the Beis HaMikdash. But that was when the Beis HaMikdash stood. What happens when it was destroyed? It says the Mishnah, Mishecharav Beis HaMikdash, Hiskin Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Sheyutoiken b'chol mokem sheyesh boy beistin. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was the sage, the leader of the Jewish people at that time, he instituted that in the absence of the Beis HaMikdash, they would blow the shofar anywhere there was a beistin. And we looked at the argument, a three-way argument in the Mishnah last time, but the halacha concludes, like the view of the Tanna Kama, the first opinion, that we blow indeed wherever there is a beistin. And the Gemara includes any beistin, even if it is only arai, even if it is only a temporary beistin, which means we don't need the great Sanhedrin of 71 or 72 members. It's sufficient to have a beistin. Now, on that, there was a sub-argument that according to some of the Rishonim, such as Rashi and the Ran, we require at least a Sanhedrin of 23 members. However, others learn literally that it's any beistin of 3 members would be sufficient to blow the shofar on Shabbos. And we mentioned indeed that this was the practice of the Rif, Rav Afasi, in North Africa in the 11th century. So in his beistin, they blew the shofar on Rosh Hashana that would fall on Shabbos. And as the Rosh explains, that according to the Rif, we don't need a Sanhedrin of 23. It's sufficient to have a beistin. As long as it is a beistin, a muflag bador, even as long as it's the most outstanding beistin of the generation, they could blow the shofar. And indeed, that is what the Rif did. But really, aside from the Rif and another couple of noted exceptions, since the temple was destroyed, since the Jewish people were exiled from Eretz Yisrael, once the Sanhedrin was disbanded, really for the last 1,000 years plus, the shofar has not been blown on Shabbos. And that's really how the halacha has been observed. That is how halacha is. We don't follow the Rif. Even his Talmidim, his own students, did not follow the opinion of their Rebbe of the Rif. And that's how things really went for many, many years. Until we come to the protagonist of our shir tonight, and that is what we are going to discuss. So you can follow along on the slides as we go through the discussion. We've looked at the Mishnah, and now we're going to move to our discussion for tonight. And we'd like to introduce a rabbinic figure, Rabbi Akiva Yosef Schlesinger. Rabbi Akiva Yosef Schlesinger was born in Hungary. And in Hungary, he was educated in the way of the Chassam Sofer, who was, of course, that great giant, that leader of Hungarian Jewry. He studied under the Ksav Sofer, and he also studied under the Maramshik, Talmidim of the Chassam Sofer, the Ksav Sofer being the son of the Chassam Sofer. And Rabbi Akiva Yosef was educated in the ways of Torah, in the study of Torah, by these great Hungarian Torah giants. He's just on the aside. The Chassam Sofer served as his moel at his bris, and the Rabbi Akiva Yosef Schlesinger was the one who really promulgated and disseminated a teaching which the Chassam Sofer is synonymous with, and that is Chadash Asur Min HaTorah. Chadash Asur Min HaTorah literally refers to the new grain, that the new grain is forbidden biblically to be eaten until the day of the offering of the Korban Omer, until the second day of Pesach. And the Chassam Sofer made a play on these words, that Chadash means any new innovations into Judaism is forbidden min ha-Torah. And of course, the Chassam Sofer was referring to the Reform movement, which was becoming very entrenched in Hungary, and he fought, and his Talmidim fought very vociferously against the Reform movement and the Enlightenment at the time. Anyway, Rabbi Akiva Yosef, who was one of the Talmidim of the disciples of the Chassam Sofer, moved to Eretz Yisrael in the year 5631. So this is the year 1870. And he settled in Yerushalaim, which already we know the old Yeshuv was home to many great Torah giants, Torah sages at that time. And he very quickly found his place over there. Now, interesting, the year that he arrived, Rosh Hashana fell on Shabbos. And that year, when he arrived, he wanted to sound the shofar on Shabbos. His understanding, as we are going to see through tonight's discussion, is that not only we can, but we should blow the shofar in Yerushalaim under certain circumstances. And he wanted to restart that minhag, that practice of blowing the shofar in Yerushalaim when Rosh Hashana would fall on Shabbos. But when he presented it to some of the Rabbanim, they opposed the move, and he left it alone. He didn't follow through with these plans. Fast forward another couple of years, 11 years approximately, to the year 5642 to 1881. Again, Rosh Hashana fell on Shabbos. And this time, Rabbi Akiva Yosef Schlesinger penned two dissertations, two halachic psakim, one in Lashon HaKodesh, one in Yiddish. And in that, he set forth his rationale, all of the reasons, and some of them we're going to touch on tonight, setting forth his rationale as to why we should be blowing the shofar in Yerushalaim on Rosh Hashana on Shabbos. But again, that year, for whatever reason, his plans did not materialize. So that's how it was for another 23 years. And it was only 23 years later that the controversy really erupted and became this international saga. So Rosh Hashana of the year 5665, which would be in the year 1904, fell out on Shabbos. And incidentally, the following year also fell on Shabbos. And we know we've had in our recent history, Rosh Hashana falling on Shabbos 2 years back to back. And so it was in those 2 years, 5565 and 5666, Rosh Hashana would fall on Shabbos. So in anticipation, in advance of Rosh Hashana 5665, Rabbi Akiva Schlesinger submitted his dissertation, his psak halacha, where he defended the practice of blowing the shofar, and he submitted it to a Hungarian Torah journal. The Hungarian Torah journal is the Tel Tapios, which was a journal in which people would submit halachic issues, Torah discussions, and the like. And it was really a source of debate. And therefore, he published in this journal, he published his arguments as to why they should be blowing the shofar when Rosh Hashana falls on Shabbos. Now, what was his plan? His plan was that on a set time, on the first day of Rosh Hashana, which would be Shabbos, he would gather together two Batei Din, the Beis Din of the Sephardi community and the Beis Din of the Ashkenazi community of Old Jerusalem, and they would gather in the Sephardi shul known as the shul of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Now, he points out that this would be a fitting location to blow the shofar, because indeed, as we saw in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai himself was the Baal HaTakana. he was the one who enacted the takana that in the absence of the Beis Hamikdash, they should blow the shofar in the presence of the Beis Din. And therefore, because he is the one who enacted this blowing of the shofar in the presence of the Beis Din, so Rabbi Akiva Yosef thought that it would be appropriate to blow the shofar on Shabbos in the presence of two Batei Din, the Sephardi and the Ashkenazi, and to do so in the shul that bears the name of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. And he published this article, and it was published in the month of Av. It was a bi-monthly, every 2 weeks this publication would come out, the Tel Tapias journal. And he published initially in the beginning of the month of Av, and then again in the middle of the month of Av in the year 5664, about 6 weeks before Rosh Hashana, that would fall out on Shabbos. And in there, really, he presented his psak from 23 years earlier that he had composed, and that was the basis of his argument, the basis of his essay. So what we'd like to do tonight is just to go through some of his arguments, to look at them, to understand what were his points. How does he prove that the shofar should be blown in the Beis Din in Yerushalaim on Rosh Hashana that falls on Shabbos? We'll perhaps look at some of the opposition, some of the critique that he received from some of the other poskim at the time, and then we will also look at how this all played out in reality in history as well, and how the great Torah sages of Jerusalem and Eretz Yisrael became enmeshed with this saga. So, let's start off where it begins. As we mentioned before, the Rif blew the shofar when Rosh Hashana fell on Shabbos in his Beis Din. Now, even though this was not a Sanhedrin Ketana of 23 members, it was certainly not a Sanhedrin Gedola of 71 members, it was a regular Beis Din made up of 3 rabbis, and the Rif, even though he was in Chutz La'aretz, even though he was outside of Yerushalaim, outside of Eretz Yisrael, nonetheless, the great Rif understood that the halacha requires that we blow the shofar when Rosh Hashana falls on Shabbos in the presence of the Beis Din. And if the Rif could do so in Chutz La'aretz, outside of Eretz Yisrael entirely, how much more so, says Rabbi Schlesinger, how much more so we in Yerushalaim, Ir HaKodesh, right next to the site of the Beis Hamikdash, we should surely do the same and blow the shofar in the presence of the Beis Din. Now, one of the points that he anticipated would be raised is, why hasn't this been done before? Why hasn't this been done before? Meaning that there were great sages who've lived in Yerushalaim for hundreds of years. We know that the Ramban, for example, was in Yerushalaim. We know that there were other sages, great sages as well. So why didn't they see fit to blow the shofar? Why is it only now? And he puts forward a number of arguments on this point. He says that perhaps, number one, they weren't allowed to have gatherings. We know that Eretz Yisrael was not under the autonomy of the Jewish people at that time. It was under various nations. In fact, at this time, it was under the Ottoman Empire, the rule of the Ottomans. But in previous generations, it might not have been permissible to gather together to blow the shofar in public. Furthermore, he notes, as we pointed out from the Tur, Rashi, and the Ramban, the Ran, and others, that there are those opinions who say that it is not enough to blow in a Beis Din of 3 members. We require a Beis Din of caliber of 23 members, which means you need to have 23 proficient sages who rule in halachic matters lemaisa. And therefore, Rabbi Schlesinger proposes that it could have been that in previous generations, they were not able to gather that many sages. There were not many of sages of that caliber living in Yerushalaim that would be able to qualify as a Sanhedrin of 23 to meet the requirements of those sages, those poskim who do require the number of 23. But he writes that now, Baruch Hashem, he's referring to the times in which he lived in Yerushalaim in the latter part of the 19th century. He says, Baruch Hashem, today, not only do we have 23 Rabbanim, not only do we have 23 great rabbis, but if necessary, we could even constitute a Sanhedrin, i.e., we could even gather 71 great rabbis, great sages, and therefore, nowadays, things are different. So that was how he addressed why things were not done. In addition, we generally have a concept that just because that's not how things were done does not mean that that's how things should be continued to be observed. Okay. So now we move on to something that we looked at last week, and that is the Rambam. It's quite a contentious Rambam, because when we saw the Rambam last week, the Rambam is a very, very high benchmark as to what constitutes an eligible Beis Din that we would be able to blow the shofar in their presence on Rosh Hashana of Shabbos. And just to recap, the Rambam says as follows. Bizman hazeh shecharav hamikdash kol makom sheyesh bo based in kavua, that nowadays, in the absence of the Beis Hamikdash, anywhere there is a based in kavua, which means it needs to be a set designated based in, samuch be'eretz Yisrael, and the members of that Sanhedrin, that based in, need to have smicha, and that means the original chain of smicha going back to Moshe Rabbeinu, and that requires to be conferred in Eretz Yisrael. Then toikim by b'Shabbos, they can blow on Shabbos. The ain toikim b'Shabbos elaba based in shekitros achodesh, and then the Rambam adds another layer of criteria that we only blow the shofar on Shabbos in the based in which sanctified the new moon. Again, back in biblical times and Talmudic times, Mishnaic times certainly, the way they would declare Rosh Chodesh, they didn't have a fixed calendar like we do. Instead, like the halacha requires, witnesses would see the new moon, they would come to Yerushalaim, they would be interrogated by the members of the Sanhedrin, and if their testimony corroborated, the Beis Din would declare the day as Rosh Chodesh. So the Rambam says that to blow the shofar in a Beis Din on Shabbos could only be done in the Beis Din which sanctified Rosh Chodesh. But any other Beis Din, one would not be able to blow the shofar there, even if they were smuchit. So according to Rambam, we need two qualities. We need that the Beis Din members have smicha from Eretz Yisrael, and number two, that it must be the Beis Din which declares Rosh Chodesh. Now that seems to rule out categorically any Beis Din that we have today, because the chain of smicha going back to Moshe Rabbeinu dissipated whilst it was resurrected in the times of the Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, but it then ceased to exist. We no longer have a Beis Din which have this original smicha. Furthermore, we no longer sanctify Rosh Chodesh by the sighting of the new moon, and therefore there is no Beis Din which declares Rosh Chodesh. And if so, that would seem to rule out the blowing of the shofar in the presence of any Beis Din nowadays, which runs contrary to the entire mission of Rabbi Akiva Yosef Schlesinger. So how does he deal with this Rambam? So he points out that this Rambam cannot be read in isolation. We need to take this in context of the next halacha in the Rambam. So this was Hilchos Shofar Perek Beis Halacha Tes. Jump forward one halacha to Perek Beis Halacha Yud. The Rambam says as follows: Bezman hazeh she'anu oisin shnei yamim bagalus. Nowadays that we keep 2 days of Rosh Hashana outside of Eretz Yisrael, kederach shetoikim b'rishon toikim b'sheni. Just as we blow the shofar on a regular Rosh Hashana in the middle of the week, we blow the shofar on the first day of Rosh Hashana. We also blow the shofar on the second day of Rosh Hashana. Okay, no problems over here. Then he continues. But if the first day of Rosh Hashana falls out on a Shabbos, and if there was not in a place where there is a Beis Din that would be fitting to blow the shofar, we only blow the shofar on the second day. Now this Rambam seems to imply that even nowadays, when A, we don't have smicha, B, we don't have a Beis Din which sanctifies Rosh Chodesh, it seems to imply that a Beis Din that could blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah Shabbos still exists today, and therefore it's only if you were not in the presence of such a Beis Din, then you wouldn't blow the shofar on the first day, you would only blow on the second day. Now, Rabbi Akiva Schlesinger is not the first one to point out this seemingly contradictory statement of the Rambam between these two halachas. This was already preempted by Rabbi Yosef Karo himself in his work on the Rambam, his commentary on the Rambam by the name of Kesef Mishnah. So in the Kesef Mishnah, he says, he addresses this contradiction. He notes that one halacha says that we need a Beis Din with smicha that sanctifies Rosh Chodesh, and the second halacha seems to say that there is a Beis Din who could blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah Shabbos nowadays as well. So how do we resolve it? He says as follows. So he says, Venirally, why did the Rambam initially write that we only blow the shofar in the Beis Din that sanctified Rosh Chodesh, Shekitros HaChodesh? Hulefi she'im hayinu matirin litkoya b'chol Beis Din, afal pishloi Kitros HaChodesh ba'oisa Beis Din. If we were to blow the shofar in any Beis Din, even the Beis Din that did not sanctify Rosh Chodesh, so if So they would come and they would blow the shofar in another city, for example, the Beis Din that did not sanctify Rosh Chodesh. They, in this other Beis Din, in another town, another city, where they did not sanctify Rosh Chodesh, because that would only be done by the greatest Beis Din of the time, any other Beis Din would not know for certainty that that day had been declared as Rosh Chodesh, because as was pointed out, that Rosh Hashana is the only Yom Tov that falls on Rosh Chodesh. So witnesses would come to this Beis Din, they would say, we saw the new moon. That Beis Din would declare Rosh Chodesh, only that Beis Din would know for sure with 100% certainty that that day was now Rosh Chodesh, and therefore it was Rosh Hashana as well. And therefore, even though it's Shabbos, they could blow the shofar because they knew for sure this was Rosh Hashana. But any other Beis Din where they did not sanctify Rosh Chodesh, they did not sanctify the new moon, could not know with certainty that this Shabbos was indeed the day of Rosh Hashana. Therefore, it was only a suffix, it was only doubtful that it was Rosh Hashana, and therefore they were not permitted to blow the shofar. And that's why the Rambam gives the qualification that you can only blow the shofar on Rosh Hashana that falls on Shabbos in the very Beis Din which sanctified Rosh Chodesh, because they are the only ones in the world who would know that for sure today is Rosh Hashana, and therefore they could blow the shofar even though it's Shabbos. Then says the Kesef Mishnah, but that only applied at a time in our history when they sanctified Rosh Chodesh by the sighting of the new moon. That practice ceased to exist already in the latter part of the Talmudic era, in the days of Rava and Abaye, and therefore the Kesef Mishnah says, the Imkain, Achshav, nowadays, that we don't sanctify the new moon. Instead, we have a fixed calendar, as established by Rabbi Hillel Nasiya, a fixed calendar. Nowadays, we base our calculation of the new moon and the establishment of the days of the Yomim Tovim based on the Cheshbon, based on this calendar. And we keep 2 days of Rosh Hashana, and the first day is the Iker, the primary day of Rosh Hashana, is the first day of Tishrei, without a doubt. And therefore, even for us, even though we are not the Beis Din that sanctified Rosh Chodesh, we know based on our calendar for certainty that the first day is indeed the first of Tishrei, is indeed Rosh Hashana, and therefore nowadays we no longer need a Beis Din that actually sanctified Rosh Chodesh. And therefore he concludes that any Beis Din which is kavua, the samuch, which is established and has smicha, they can blow even if they didn't sanctify Rosh Chodesh. So Rabbi Akiva Yosef draws on this Kesef Mishnah, and he says that nowadays, where we don't sanctify Rosh Chodesh, every Beis Din knows that today is Rosh Hashana. We should be able to blow the shofar in any Beis Din. Why do we need the Beis Din at all? As mentioned before, that the Emas Hadin, the awe of the Beis Din, would ensure that people do not carry the shofar on Shabbos. And then Rabbi Akiva Yosef makes a fascinating statement after bringing this argument, and he says we have to reconcile the Rambam in this way, so that he does not go at loggerheads with his Rebbe, the Rif. The Rif, whilst he was not direct Rebbe of the Rambam learned from one of the Talmidim of the Rif, but nonetheless, we don't want the Rambam, who generally follows the halachas of the Rif in his halachic rulings, we don't want to have the Rambam contradicting the Rif. The Rif says that we could blow the shofar in any Beis Din of 3, as he did himself. The Rambam initially writes that we need a Beis Din that sanctifies Rosh Chodesh. They can't contradict one another. Therefore, if we take this resolution that requirement only applied when they would sanctify Rosh Chodesh based on the sighting of the moon in the presence of the Beis Din, then nowadays when we have a fixed calendar, there is no longer that concern, and any Beis Din which would meet the status of a great Beis Din would be enough to blow the shofar there. So that's the next argument that Rabbi Akiva Yosef brings. Moving along, we then raise another issue. And that is as follows. What is a Reshus Harabim? The concern of the sages is that a person may carry the shofar Dalad Amos, 4 Amos in the Reshus Harabim, in a public domain, that would violate Shabbos on the biblical level, and therefore they made a gezerah not to blow the shofar in order to protect the sanctity of Shabbos. Now, to qualify as a Reshus Harabim, and what qualifies as a Reshus Harabim, is a matter of debate in the Rishonim, and that carries through all the way to Halacha. Certainly the Ashkenazi Rishonim, Tosfos and Rashi, and this is brought in the Shulchan Aruch as well, is that to qualify as a Reshus Harabim Midda Oraisa, it's not enough just to be a public area or a wide open street. One needs to have Shishim Riboy, 600,000 traverses on that street or in that city every single day. Now, there are very few places in the world that would qualify for that. I personally have been in one of them. It was a crossing in Japan, in the middle of Tokyo, where you could have anywhere between 5 to 10,000 people crossing the road at one time. It was a 5-6-way intersection. But certainly Yerushalaim at that time, and really most of the cities in the settled Jewish world would not have qualified as a biblical Rishus Harabim. And therefore, even if a person were to carry their shofar on Shabbos in the public domain, it would not qualify as a biblical prohibition. It would only be rabbinically forbidden, as they have traveled in an area which has the status of a Carmelist. And therefore, whilst when the rabbis initially made their decree, their gezerah, that we don't blow the shofar lest the person carry, their concern is that a person would carry in a biblical Rishus Harabim and violate a biblical prohibition. But nowadays, where the concern would only be for a rabbinic violation of Shabbos, carrying in a rabbinic Rishus Harabim or a Carmelist, therefore the gezerah has less effect or less necessity, because it is only to protect against the rabbinic law, and therefore, and even then it's a suffix, it's a doubt that maybe a person will carry, and therefore the gezerah is not as strong. Now, as I mentioned before, not everyone agrees with this definition of the Rishus Harabim. The Rambam, for example, the Rambam says that no, the Rambam doesn't bring this qualification that a Rishus Harabim must have 600,000 traverses every day, or people living in the city. And the Rambam simply brings, like the Mishnah itself says, is that as long as you have a road, a street, which is Tes Zayin Amma, 16 Ammas wide, and it is mefulish, it goes through the city from gate to gate, and the doors are open at night, their gates are open at night, and they're never closed, that is a Rishus Harabim. And according to the Rambam, therefore, a real biblical Rishus Harabim is very prevalent, and it's very common. Most cities would qualify in that regards. And therefore, according to the Rambam, there should be the need for this gezerah, lest a person come to carry the shofar in the Rishus Harabim on Shabbos. Nonetheless, Rabbi Schlesinger addresses this by saying that here we are not suggesting to blow the shofar in any city. We are proposing to blow the shofar in Yerushalaim. And what's unique about Yerushalaim is that the Gemara in Masechta Eruvin tells us that Yerushalaim does not have the status of a Rishus Harabim Mid'oraisa, because the gates are closed at night. So therefore, even though Yerushalaim may have wide streets that go from one end to the other, Yerushalaim is not a Rishus Harabim Mid'oraisa, and his proposal was to blow the shofar in Yerushalaim, and therefore the gezerah would not necessarily apply. And we're going to come back to that discussion on the status of Yerushalaim, because that might be unique in other ways. Based on this, he concludes that at worst, what are we talking about? We're talking about, again, shofar is a biblical mitzvah. It's a very powerful mitzvah. And what is the concern? That someone may carry it. Nowadays, he argues, even if someone would carry the shofar in the streets of Yerushalaim, it would only be a rabbinic issur according to the Rambam, and according to all of the other poskim, certainly so. It would only be a rabbinic issur. It's only a suffix, a doubt, that maybe someone would come to carry the shofar. That is a suffix to Rabbanan, a doubt in a rabbinic law. And furthermore, it's not something that applies to everyone. It only applies to the Baal Tekeah. That whereas in previous times, maybe every person would blow the shofar for themselves at home, nowadays, like we have in our shuls, although this year is going to be very different in Melbourne, but in previous years, as we do, one Baal Tekeah will blow for the entire shul. So we're not even concerned about every Tom, Dick, and Harry, to use that expression, carrying the shofar in the Rishus Harabim, which would only be rabbinic anyway. We're worried about the Baal Tekeah. And generally speaking, the Baal Tekeah is someone who is eligible, someone who meets the fitting criteria of someone who blows the shofar on behalf of the community, would be a person of significant Torah knowledge, and therefore very doubtful that they would come to carry the shofar. Now, even if one were to argue, he says, that there is indeed this rabbinic decree that one should not blow the shofar on Shabbos, even under such circumstances, he puts the following postulation, and he says that if the Baal Tekeah chooses of his own volition to do a slight rabbinic infraction, such as going against this gezerah by blowing the shofar on Shabbos, in order to ensure that the community, the masses, are able to fulfill their biblical obligation, that requirement of a mitzvah derabim, a mitzvah of the masses, can supersede the prohibition of blowing the shofar of Rosh Hashana on Shabbos of a single individual. And he brings an interesting proof. What is that proof? So the Gemara in Brachas tells us the following account. The sage Rabbi Eliezer had a Canaanite slave. Now, a Canaanite slave, the Torah tells us that we are not allowed to emancipate. We're not allowed to free a Canaanite slave. It says, La'olam bahem ta'avodu, you have to work them forever. They remain in their service. So it's a prohibition. One is not allowed to free a Canaanite slave. Anyway, one day Rabbi Eliezer rocks up to the shul. It's a regular weekday. It's not Rosh Hashana. It's not Kol Nidre. And he gets to shul. There are only 9 people in shul, 9 Jewish men in shul over the age of bar mitzvah. And this Canaanite slave, and a Canaanite slave cannot count towards a minyan. According to the Rosh's interpretation, Rabbi Eliezer freed his Canaanite slave then and there on the spot, who then becomes a fully fledged Jewish male and became the 10th man for the minyan. So what's going on? Even though there is a biblical prohibition of freeing a Canaanite slave, he freed the Canaanite slave to ensure that there could be a minyan to daven with, even though a minyan davening with the minyan davening in general is only a rabbinic obligation. So what did he do? He violated his own personal biblical prohibition of freeing a slave in order to enable the rabbim, the masses, to fulfill their mitzvah of davening with a minyan, even though it's only rabbinic. Says Rabbi Schlesinger, if so, in our case, where it's actually reversed, the shofar, which is the mitzvah of the masses, is a biblical mitzvah. Blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashana of Shabbos is at worst a rabbinic decree of the sages, lest the person come to carry in what nowadays would only be a rabbinic Rishus HaRabbim. Certainly, the Baal Tekeya can violate that questionable rabbinic decree nowadays in order to blow the shofar and allow the masses to fulfill their biblical obligation of sounding the shofar. So that's the next argument that he makes. Moving ahead, he draws an argument to support from a Tosfos that we looked at last week. This is the Tosfos at the very beginning of the chapter of the Gemara Chavtes Amud Beis, where we see from this Tosfos that when the sages enacted, when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said that they should blow the shofar in the presence of the Beis Din, we see that they did not want to uproot the mitzvah of shofar entirely. That was the kavanah. Again, in the times of the Beis Hamikdash, they would blow the shofar in the Beis Hamikdash. After that was destroyed, where would they blow? So they instituted that we should blow the shofar in the Beis Din when Rosh Hashana falls on Shabbos. Let's contrast that to the lulav. Nowadays, and that is indeed the halacha after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, we do not take the lulav on Shabbos. Even if the first day of Sukkot, where the mitzvah of lulav is a biblical mitzvah, we don't take the lulav on Shabbos. And we don't do it anywhere, even in the presence of the Beis Din. So Tosfos asked that question, why is shofar different to lulav? Why did the rabbis allow shofar to be blown at the side of the Beis Din, yet they did not allow the lulav to be taken in the site of the Beis Din, even though essentially it's the same gezerah that a person might come to carry? So Tosfos answers as follows. V'yesh loymar, we could say, the shofar is a unique mitzvah. The shofar serves to raise up a favorable remembrance of the Jewish people before Hashem, before our Father in heaven. Therefore, the sages did not want to entirely uproot the shofar so that the shofar would not be blown anywhere in the Jewish world on the day of Rosh Hashana, the first day which fell out on Shabbos. And therefore, they allowed the Beis Din to blow the shofar in the presence of the Beis Din. The kiven to takun b'chad Beis Din, takun b'chol makom sheyesh Beis Din. And since the rabbis allowed the shofar, they wanted one place at least to blow the shofar. They said that the Beis Din could blow the shofar, and therefore they extended that at any place there is a Beis Din, they could blow the shofar. So whereas lulav, the rabbis were happy to dispense with completely on Shabbos, that we don't take the lulav even on the first day, shofar, because it is so powerful and so important, it's a day of judgment that Hashem remembers us favorably. We see from this that the rabbis did not want to. The intent of their gezerah was not to uproot the mitzvah of shofar entirely. Either it was blown in the Beis Hamikdash or it was blown in the side of the Beis Din. And if so, he says that it is incumbent upon us to make sure that the shofar is blown in at least one place, because if we do not blow the shofar here, the shofar will not be blown anywhere, and then the mitzvah will be uprooted completely. He adds to this an argument that according to the Rambam, the status of Yerushalaim is unique. If we go back to the very opening Mishnah that we started, the Mishnah says when Rosh Hashana falls on Shabbos, they would blow the shofar in the Beis Hamikdash, but not in the Medina. Whilst most of the Rishonim learned that the Beis Hamikdash means only the site of the Beis Hamikdash himself, the Rambam, both in Mishnah Torah and in the Pirush HaMishnayos, says as follows: Yom Tov Rosh Hashana shechal diyos b'Shabbos, kvar bi'arnu pa'amim. We've explained a number of times already, ki mikdash tikra Yerushalaim kula. That the word mikdash in the Mishnah refers not only to the Beis Hamikdash, it refers to the entire Medina, the entire Yerushalaim, I should say. And the Medina is all of the other cities outside of Yerushalaim, elsewhere in Eretz Yisrael. So according to the Rambam, Yerushalaim has the status of the Mikdash. And we know that even though the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed, it retains its Kedusha, it retains its holiness, it retains its unique status. And therefore, based on this Rambam, the same applies to Yerushalaim. That even though Yerushalaim has been destroyed, even though the temple is destroyed, Yerushalaim is considered like the Mikdash, the sanctity still remains, and therefore it was never subject to the rabbinic gezerah of not blowing the shofar. Right? Because the rabbi said when they made that decree that you cannot blow the shofar on Rosh Hashana of Shabbos, that was only outside of the Mikdash. And according to the Rambam, the Mikdash includes Yerushalaim. And therefore Yerushalaim was never precluded from blowing the shofar on Shabbos. And therefore it is still the same today that in Yerushalaim, he argues we should be able to blow the shofar. And technically we don't need a Beis Din at all. The Beis Din was only after the temple was destroyed to replace Yerushalaim, to replace the Beis HaMikdash. But in the Beis HaMikdash itself, there was never a requirement of a Beis Din. And therefore, he says that by us having a Beis Din, that only strengthens our case for blowing the shofar, which the Beis Din may technically not be required at all because Yerushalaim has the status of the Mikdash. Then he moves on to what I would say is a more emotional argument in favor of blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashana of Shabbos of that year, of the year 5665, Rosh Hashana. And that is as follows. We have a pasuk. The pasuk in Kapitel Kuf Yotes says, Eis lasois laHashem heiferu toratzecha. And literally means it is a time to act for Hashem, and therefore they nullify your Torah. And what does that mean? We learn from this that in certain instances, we are able to nullify the Torah, which means that where there are certainly rabbinic laws or certain rabbinic traditions, in a time where it is necessary to act for the sake of Hashem, we can disregard those rabbinic laws. And what was he referring to? He was referring to a historical phenomenon at the time, as we know that in the latter part of the 19th century, there were terrible pogroms in Eastern Europe, in Russia specifically. We had pogroms in Kishinev, we had in Kiev, and we had in Bialystok, etc. It was a time of great difficulty for our Jewish brethren living in Eastern Europe. He writes that we've been ravaged by these attacks, and says the Jewish blood is flowing, is being spilled like water. And further, the Jewish people suffer many gezeros, many edicts and decrees against them. They have suffered exiles. We know that they were limited to living in the Pale of Settlement and the like. And of course, that has presented very harsh realities for the Jewish people, in addition to the struggles that they have for Parnasa. And therefore, that is the Eis Lasois Hashem. It's terrible, terrible times. And things are very, very difficult. And one could argue, obviously, Chas v'Shalom not the same, but we ourselves are living through very difficult times as well. And therefore, he argues that on Rosh Hashana, which is the day on which the world is being judged, and as we say this in the Unasana Tokef, Mi Yichya, who will live and who will pass away, who will be wealthy, who will be poor, who will be hungry, etc. All of that judgment takes place on the day of Rosh Hashana, and that is the judgment for the entire year. We need to have, he argues, we need the merit of the shofar this year on Rosh Hashana because of the condition of the Jewish people, in order to confound the Satan when he accuses us, so that these terrible things, we arouse Hashem's mercy. That's what the shofar achieves. It causes Hashem to arise from the chair of judgment onto the throne of mercy, and therefore we need it. And then he says as follows, quoting a pasuk in Parshas Toldos, when Yaakov came in to receive the blessings of his father, he was dressed up like Esav. He had the goat skins on his hair, on the back of his neck. And Yitzchak said, I want to feel you, to see if this was really Esav or not. And when he felt his hands, he said, Hakol kol Yaakov vayadayim yedei Esav. the voice is the voice of Yaakov. It sounds like Yaakov, but the hands, the hairy hands, are the hands of Esav. Now, what does this represent? So he says as follows. The Yadayim Yadei Esav, the hand of Esav, represents the violence which is perpetrated by the nations of the world, the followers or the descendants of Esav, which is the Christian world, against the Jewish people. Their hands, their fight against the Jewish people, their violence. The Kol Yaakov, the voice of Yaakov, alludes, like the Zohar says, to the sound of the shofar. And therefore he says that the Kol Yaakov, the voice of the shofar of Yaakov, can prevent and remove the Yadayim Yadei Esav, the violent hands of Esav. And therefore, in our times, when we suffer from the hands of Esav, we need the merit of the voice of Yaakov. We need to blow the shofar at the beginning of the year to protect us, to give us merit, to bring us chusim. And then he quotes from the Gemara. The Gemara tells us, Kol shana she'ein toikin la b'tchilasa, meriin la b'seifa. Any year where they do not blow the shofar at the beginning of the year will be a year where there is evil, negativity, harm at the end of the year. My time, what is the reason? The ear of Satan, because they did not blow the shofar in Rosh Hashana, they did not confound the Satan, which means that the Satan's accusations were effective, and the Jewish people would be judged for negative repercussions in the year ahead. Now, normally when Rosh Hashana falls on Shabbos, we don't blow the shofar, but that's really, we don't have a choice in that matter. And therefore, that's the reason we don't blow the shofar. It's what we call oines. And therefore, we don't need to worry about this. But Rabbi Akiva Yosef argues that now we live in Yerushalaim. We have enough sages to constitute a Beis Din. And we have a very strong argument that we should blow the shofar. If we do not blow the shofar, then it is something deliberate, and therefore it is problematic, and we need to have that merit in our times. And he draws a parallel, an interesting parallel. When the Jewish people faced the Gezer in the times of Haman and Achashverosh, Haman wanted to destroy all of the Jewish people. Mordechai and Esther, as part of their plan to save the Jewish people, enacted a series of 3 fast days. Now, whilst we observe a fast of Tainis Esther on Erev Purim, the reality was that those 3 fast days, according to the Gemara, fell out and included the first night of Pesach. Now, the first night of Pesach, there's a mitzvah to eat matzah. It's a biblical mitzvah. And yet, Mordechai and Esther made that decree and said, no, we are fasting, no one will eat matzah. And why did they argue? They said, if there's no Jewish people, if we're going to be destroyed by Haman and his cronies, then why do I need Pesach? There's not a need for the Yom Tov of Pesach. And just as they took upon themselves to remove, to negate, to do something wrong, to negate the mitzvah of matzah in order to protect the Jewish people and save them from being killed, so too, he says, we can violate this minor infraction of blowing the shofar against the wishes of the sages, which until now we've proved is highly questionable if that still applies. And therefore, it is necessary in order to help our brethren where Jewish blood is being spilled like water. So that was a more emotional argument that he made. Now, practically, what did he do? So these are the arguments he published in the publication of Tel Talpios of this Hungarian Torah journal. He took his Psak Halacha, his original one from the year 5642. He took that original Psak Halacha and he brought it with the publication, and he went to the Aderes. Who was the Aderes? The Aderes was, it's an acronym for his name, Rabbi Eliyahu David Ta'imim Rabinovich, and he was the newly installed Ashkenazi Rav of Yerushalaim. The Rav was Reb Shmuel Salant, who we'll see in a moment, that he was getting very elderly. He needed someone to help him, and that was the Aderes. So Rabbi Akiva Yosef took his arguments and discussed them with the Rav of Yerushalaim, the Aderes, and he records in one of his publications in the Tel Talpios that the Aderes not only agreed with his position that they should blow the shofar in Yerushalaim on Shabbos that year, but he in fact encouraged it very strongly. And he said, at this point, Rabbi Akiva Yosef didn't realize this himself, but the Aderes says that not only this year, Rosh Hashana 5655, but Rosh Hashana 5666 will also fall out on Shabbos, in which case it will be 2 years back to back of Rosh Hashana on Shabbos. If we don't blow the shofar now, it will be 2-3 years before we blow the shofar again on the first day of Rosh Hashana, and therefore we must blow the shofar this year. It's recorded that the Aderes was personally worried that he might not live to hear the shofar again on the first day of Rosh Hashana, that he might not live out those 2 years. And indeed, he did pass away in Adar 5665, and therefore he did not live till Rosh Hashana 5667, which would have been the next weekday Rosh Hashana, and his fear was in fact realized. Rabbi Yechiel Michal Takachinsky, who was a famous rabbi at the time, who wrote extensively on the laws of Eretz Yisrael, Yerushalaim, and the Beit HaMikdash, he records in his sefer that the Aderes said that if Rabbi Akiva Yosef Schlesinger would blow the shofar on Rosh Hashana of 5665, he would personally have gone to stand behind the doorway to listen to the sound of the shofar. See, Aderes was very, very positive about this. But he also suggested that they go and speak with the Sephardi chief rabbi at the time, who was the Rishon LeZion. The Sephardi chief rabbi was an individual by the name of Rabbi Yaakov Shaul El-Yashar. And he suggested that they get his consent as well. He said, well, would the Aderes, the Rav of Yerushalaim, the Ashkenazi Rav, go and speak to him? He says, no, I'm too old for that, but I'll send my son. So Rabbi Akiva Yosef went together with the son of the Aderes, and they presented the argument that they wanted to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashana Shabbos in the presence of both the Ashkenazi based in and the Sephardi based in Yerushalaim, in the shul of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. He asked for time, let me think about it, etc. Ultimately, he said that he does not support the initiative. And one of the things he said is that Rabbi Shmuel Salant, who was the elder, foremost Ashkenazi sage in Yerushalaim, was against this idea. So Rabbi Schlesinger, who heard that Rabbi Shmuel Salant was against the idea, he went to speak to him to find out the reason for his opposition. That's a picture of Rav Shmuel Salant. And he asked him, he went to speak to him and said, why are you opposed to this? To which he responded, on the contrary, it's not true that I'm opposed to it. And when you first raised the matter in 5642, I myself had hoped to be able to hear the shofar on Rosh Hashana on Shabbos. So therefore, he was very supportive of it. Not only that, but he gave a very strong argument that could be used in support. What was that argument? It's a fascinating idea. How many days of Rosh Hashana do we celebrate? We certainly celebrate 2. We celebrate in Chutz Aretz, every Yom Tov is celebrated as 2 days. But in Eretz Yisrael, where they celebrate only 1 day Pesach, 1 day Sukkot, 1 day Shavuos, there is a discussion in the Rishonim how many days of Rosh Hashana should be kept. This is a machloikas of the Rishonim. Rabbeinu Ephraim and other Rishonim say that once we have a fixed calendar, the minhag, the halacha for Eretz Yisrael is to keep only 1 day of Rosh Hashana. There were those who argued with him, the Chachamim of Provence, as well as the Rif himself. They said that no, Rosh Hashana is different to every other Yom Tov, and in Eretz Yisrael they also have to observe 2 days of Rosh Hashana, even though we have a fixed calendar. Now, for hundreds of years, the minhag in Eretz Yisrael was like the view of Rabbeinu Ephraim. Indeed, we see that there is a letter of Rav Hai Gaon was written to. He was against. He said they should keep 2 days, but he was written to about why it is that in Eretz Yisrael, in Yerushalaim, they keep only 1 day of Rosh Hashana. So we see this is how it was done, and for hundreds of years that was the minhag. Until in the 12th century, many Talmidei Chachamim from Provence came and they settled in Yerushalaim, and they used force to change the minhag, that they imposed their position on the Jews in Eretz Yisrael and Yerushalaim, that they should keep 2 days of Rosh Hashana, like the view of the Rif. So Rav Shmuel Salant says as follows: how can we go like the Rif on one matter of Rosh Hashana and not the other? If we follow the Rif to keep 2 days of Rosh Hashana, we should also follow the Rif, who himself did and allows the blowing of the shofar in any Beis Din on Rosh Hashana, which falls on Shabbos. And the rationale was as follows: that if we're not going to follow the Rif and we're not going to blow shofar, okay, fine. But then we should also not follow the Rif with regards to 2 days of Rosh Hashana, because if we observe 2 days of Rosh Hashana instead of 1, then on that second day, on that Sunday, we will not be putting on tefillin, which is a mitzvah d'oraisa, it's a biblical mitzvah. So by following the Rif in one law and not in the other, not only are we not blowing the shofar, but we're also missing out a day on tefillin. He says you can't pull the rope at both ends. It's one way or the other. Either go fully like the Rif or not like the Rif at all. And therefore, this was a very strong proof, which Rabbi Akiva Yosef strongly agreed with, and he published this in his work as well. So then what happened? Well, the Sephardi based in, the Sephardim under Rabbi Yashar, the Sephardi chief rabbi, had backed out. They did not support the initiative. So his plan was set in motion for Rosh Hashana with the support of the Aderes, the Rav of Yerushalaim, in Rosh Hashana 5665, that they would gather together in the shul known as the Tiferet Yisrael Shul, also known as Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. It was the Ashkenazi, the primary Ashkenazi shul in Old Yerushalaim. Some of us know that as the Churva shul, which was destroyed by the Jordanians and in the 6 Day War, or after the 6 Day War, prior to the 6 Day War, after the 48 War, and it has recently been rebuilt in the most beautiful way. And what he planned to do is on Rosh Hashana morning, after Kriyas HaTorah, to blow the 30 sounds of the shofar like we do, the 30 biblical required notes of the shofar in the presence of 2 Ashkenazi Batei Din, and in addition to that, to bring other sages, other Chachamim, so that they would have 23 Rabbanim present, that we would also satisfy the requirement, according to some, that one needs to have a Sanhedrin of 23. Elsewhere, he writes that there would be no less than 5 Batei Din present. But at least the plan was to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashana of that year. And this, they had ideas how it would be done, how you would manage the crowd. Inside, you would only have the Rabbanim, and people would gather around outside. There was a worry, what about the crush, and what about the rush, etc. But let's put that aside. What happened was, as soon as word got out, there started to be murmurings in the community, in the old Yeshuv in Yerushalaim. The Kollel, the various groups, publicly supported communities there, took issue with this. The Kanoim, what we would say is the radicals, and there was intense and fierce opposition to the practice, to the extent that they were worried that if they will blow the shofar on Rosh Hashana, on Shabbos in the shul, it is likely that there will be violence, it's likely that there will be machlokes, and that it would be necessary to bring in police to quell it. And therefore, in the interest of Shalom, they shelved the idea for that year, and they said, we will try again the next year. So they stood down. Now, in anticipation of the next year of Rosh Hashana, that's why he authored these articles in these journals. He said, I'm going to write to the venerable sages in Chutz La'aretz, outside of Eretz Yisrael, so that hopefully they will agree with my opinion, and that they will have influence over these kolim, over these individuals who sought to oppose the blowing of the shofar on Shabbos, and hopefully then we'll be able to do that on the following Rosh Hashana 5666. And that's why he wrote at the very beginning of 5665, in order to give time for this debate to play out. And indeed, that's what happened. We don't have time to go into it now, but there was back and forth in these publications over the next few months. People writing critiques, questions, challenges, to which Rabbi Akiva Yosef would respond, and a whole back and forth ensued. And the hope was that they would concur. Now, some additional arguments that he makes over there is that the Shulchan Aruch says, Yom Tov Shel Rosh Hashana Shechal Yos B'Shabbos Ein Toikim B'Shofar. It says we don't blow the shofar. It doesn't say Asur Litkoy Shofar. It does not say it's forbidden. It says we don't do it, which implies that even according to the Shulchan Aruch, there is scope to be able to do so. Another argument that he makes is that the Lashon of the Mishnah is Hiskin Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai Shu Toikim B'Chol Makom Sheish Bo Beisim. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai made a takana, which is an obligatory requirement to blow the shofar in a Beis Din. It's not just if you could, or it's a nice thing to do. He established that this is what you must do, and therefore one must actively fulfill this if one can. Ultimately, what happened the following year is that again, he had plans to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashana of Shabbos. Again, it did not materialize. There was challenges to it. It was not supported. And therefore it did not materialize. There are rumors that whilst it was not blown publicly, the shofar was not blown publicly that Shabbos in the Tiferet Yisrael Shul as was planned, but Rabbi Akiva Yosef blew the shofar himself in his own room, in his own private domain on Rosh Hashana on Shabbos, and that is based on his main argument, is that Yerushalaim is different to the rest of Eretz Yisrael. Yerushalaim, like the Rambam says, has the status of the Mikdash, and therefore does not require a Beis Din at all. And that was his argument. Now, just interesting, in the media, those who've been following media out of Eretz Yisrael, there is a push by some individuals to blow the shofar on Har Habayis, on the Temple Mount, on Rosh Hashana, the first day which falls on Shabbos this year. Now, obviously, there is a political motivation behind that as well. We know that, unfortunately, Har Habayis is not in our control. It's questionable halachically whether Jews should be going up or not, but put that aside, is unfortunately Jews who go up are not allowed to bear religious symbols, they're not allowed to pray, they haven't been allowed to blow the shofar in the past on Rosh Hashana, but drawing on this Mishnah, he wants to blow the shofar, this group want to blow the shofar on the side of the Beis HaMikdash. Anyway, we don't necessarily follow this ruling of Rabbi Akiva Yosef Schlesinger. Most of the later poskim argue very, very strongly with it. One of note is Rav Zevin. Rav Zevin writes that many of his arguments are very easily dismissed, and therefore we don't blow the shofar, certainly not in Yerushalaim and not on Har Bayis either. Just to conclude with something interesting, a little bit of historical support. We mentioned before that the Rif blew the shofar in his base in when Rosh Hashana fell on Shabbos, and there were other places as well where they did so. Just interesting bit of historical support from the Cairo Geniza, which we mentioned was a real repository, a treasure trove of halachic and Jewish literature and material. So one of the things they found in the Cairo Geniza was fragments of a piyut. We know that in Rosh Hashana we add piyutim to our davening, to the Shemana Esrei, to the Chazan's repetition, both in Shachris and Musaf. And there are different piyutim, different customs, different communities say. And there are certain piyutim which were said when Rosh Hashana would fall on Shabbos. And in one of these piyutim, the piyut says as follows. This is, we don't know when exactly it's dated from, but it's quite an old piyut. And in this fragment, it says as follows. Melech hizir bevad, O king who warned the court, shiu toikin bebeis havad, that they should blow in the gathering of the court. B'Shabbos v'Rosh Hashana, that's the refrain, on Shabbos, which is Rosh Hashana. Melech hizkam belimud, O king who strengthened them with learning, with teaching. She has shofar kosher la'amud, that the shofar should be tied to the amud, to the bima. B'Shabbos v'Rosh Hashana, on Shabbos, which is Rosh Hashana. Melech birer la'eda, the king who made it clear to the congregation, shelo yitzku'u ela bifnei rashei tu'uda, that they should only blow in the presence of the lawmakers. B'Shabbos v'Rosh Hashana, on Shabbos, which is Rosh Hashana. Melech racha shelo yimshach b'yad, ava yinasem boi poi v'hu meguyad, the king who said that they should not hold the shofar in their hand, but should place their lips upon it while it was tied up. Shabbos Rosh Hashana, on Shabbos Rosh Hashana, and finally the Shabbos Rosh Hashana chizek v'shima shelo yibachutz la'aretz toikin tekiah, O king who sounded that they should not blow the shofar outside of in chutz la'aretz. Now, what's interesting to point out is it seems from this piyut, again, go back, the original concern of the sages is that they might come to carry the shofar in the Reshus HaRabim on Shabbos. That was not applied in the site of the Beis Din. According to this piyut, and the piyut is much later, it's not from before the destruction of the temple, it's from a later period, says that they would blow the shofar in the place of the Beis Din, and they would do so by tying the shofar to the bima, and the Baal Tekeh would place their lips on the shofar without touching it in their hand and blow as a heker, as a reminder not to carry the shofar. Anyway, we are out of time. I had hoped that we would also get to some of the Chassidus on this, where there's a treasure trove, there's a wealth about it, and perhaps we'll leave that for another time. Just quickly, a question came in. What about when everyone is at home? There should not be a worry that anyone would carry the shofar on Shabbos to shul. I'll preempt that with another question. We live in a community where there's an Eruv, and with an Eruv, even if you carry the shofar on Shabbos, it would not be a violation. The answer to both of those questions is that when the rabbis made a decree, when the Chachamim made a takana, even if the reason no longer applies, the Gezerah, the takana, remains in force until such time as we have a Beis Din of equal number and caliber to repeal that decree. So since the rabbis made a decree at a time where there was a Reshus HaRabim D'Oraisa, where they didn't necessarily have Eruvin everywhere, where people did go out to carry the shofar, they made the decree then. And therefore that decree remains in force. The Rebbe suggests at the end of a Maimer that when Mashiach will come, all of these types of gazetas, which are really to forward against negative things, will be repealed. They won't be required anymore. And therefore we'll be able to blow the shofar once again. Certainly with the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash, the Beis HaMikdash HaShlishi will be able to blow the shofar. And Be'ezras Hashem, Mashiach will come right now, so we don't need to worry about lockdown in Melbourne. We'll be able to daven with the minyan of the entire Jewish people together. We'll be able to daven at the Beis HaMikdash HaShlishi with Mashiach himself, and to be able to hear the sounding of the shofar once again in the cities of Yerushalaim, in the site of the Beis Hamikdash, and it will be then for all time.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Okay.
Amen.
Thank you for joining us. There is another shir which is going to take place with Rabbi Yossi Gordon on Nach. Please sign in and enjoy. Wishing you a Ksiva Chasima Tova.